look, Tim, we don't expect you to be Arnold Fruchtenbaum. No one can be Arnold Fruchtenbaum. But you have gifts that we want you to use as well. And so I'm so grateful that while I've been reminded that several people have said, oh, Dr. Fruchtenbaum, those are big shoes to fill. My typical response is, I could never fill Arnold's shoes, but I hope to walk faithfully in his steps. So I look forward to one of the things that Dr. Fruchtenbaum loved to do, and that's to come here to speak to this august crowd of people who must love God's Word and to study it deeply, because that's what he loves to do. And I look forward to sharing with you from God's Word today, tomorrow, and the next day. And then I get to fly home and be with my family in North Carolina. So there we go. My name's Tim Sigler. I began serving with RL Ministries on July 1st of last year. And, you know, I'm signed up long term. So we'll see what the Lord does. I've been asked to present on your overall topic of Israel and the Middle East. And certainly our minds are turned toward this theme, especially in light of current events after the tragic attack on October 7th. Our concerns about that will be focused on Sunday's presentation. But a little backstory. I taught at Moody Bible Institute for 18 years in Chicago and lived in the northwest suburbs. When my colleague and I, both our wives were in a Bible study together, and he and I were among 3 Hebrew professors at the school. We called ourselves the biblical law firm of Schmutzer, Wexler, and Sigler. So we were teaching biblical law, you could say, and we were teaching Hebrew. And this particular professor, Dr. Wexler, he was an early riser, and he's kind of like Arnold, very productive in his writing. I used to joke that before breakfast he's already submitted 3 articles for some journal. And some of his articles he wrote in Hebrew, or in German, or in French. You know, he's just one of those massively intelligent guys. And he would pick me up sometime about 10 till 6 in the morning so we could beat the morning rush. And he would often listen to NPR as we drove downtown. NPR, you know, National Palestinian Radio. And on one occasion, there was an episode where there was this report live from Jerusalem by a correspondent named Shirley Jihad. Now, I like to joke that that's not just her name, but that was her answer on all policies related to Israel. Shirley Jihad. And it kind of was true, and I'll illustrate why. So he's driving along. We're on the Edens Expressway coming south into the city from the northwest suburbs, and we're listening to Shirley Jihad tell just about this current round of fighting with various uprisings among Palestinian groups, especially around Bethlehem, where early around 2000 a security wall was built, and some didn't like that because, well, there were a number of suicide bombings that had happened in Jerusalem on public buses and public places. I have a personal friend. She is an Arab Christian pharmacist, and her family for some generations have owned a pharmacy right inside the old city. Her husband was actually killed in a suicide bombing on a bus in Jerusalem. So this hits close to home. Shirley Jihad was reporting about this curfew that had been established in Bethlehem because some of the uprisings. This curfew that meant that after dark people can't go out of their homes, and the city is on lockdown under military control because there had been these terrorist uprisings, and at dark, you know, things happen, shootings and things like this, so they just kind of closed the place down. And she interviewed a female Palestinian medical doctor, the mother of 2 young children, and really got into her personal story. And this female medical doctor, Palestinian mother, I mean, she was very compelling. And if you know anything about radio, you realize, wait, but it's not a live interview because the sound quality is just too good. I mean, it wasn't just her voice. It was that when she would speak, and by the way, she had this perfect English, but with an authentic Arabic accent. And her voice was very attractive sounding. And she shared just how deeply sorrowful she was about this curfew, and it was all because of the occupation, because of the Israelis. They have troubled us so much, and I cannot even go from my house to get milk for my children to drink. And right then you hear, cue up the children, right, and it is because of the occupation and the soldiers, and then cue up the you hear the machine guns, and then the tanks rolling through town. And again, if you know anything about radio, you realize it takes work to get those soundtracks in there at just the right time. Like nobody could have ever been at the right time, at the right place, with the right equipment to record. I cannot even to go from my house at night to get milk for my children when and then, you know, that doesn't happen. This was all a staged production, not a live interview. And then she said, you know, and to be fair, now we should also hear from the Israeli side about this military curfew and lockdown on the city of Bethlehem. And by the way, just to mention Bethlehem, this is to appeal to all the Christians out there, because Bethlehem, the city where Jesus is born, this has got to make everybody very sympathetic. And it was probably, you know, getting close to Christmas time when this interview was going on. So we have poor, suffering people in Bethlehem with tanks and soldiers and children, and then she says, and now for the Israeli side, I would like to interview the Major General from the Israeli Defense Forces, in a long Hebrew name that you can't pronounce, and in very broken English he says, well, we have to have the curfew because of the terrorists in the story. And so, reporting live from Jerusalem, Shirley Jihad for NPR. My friend about swerve off the road. He's like, are you kidding me? I mean, this is the one-sided, lopsided approach to reporting on Israel and the Middle East that our students are getting. They're probably as confused as all get out. I mean, they're going to hear reports like this, reports. They're going to hear staged, dramatic broadcasting like this, and they're going to be very confused about what to think about what's going on in Israel and then in the Middle East. We got to do something about this. And so we started thinking, like, well, maybe we could have a chapel. Maybe the provost, we could talk to him. He's written multiple books on Israel and the Middle East. He's led over 100 trips to Israel for study tours. The provost at the time was Charlie Dyer, a well-known dispensational author who loves Israel and is very informative about the Middle East. Even to this day, he has a program, some of you may have heard, called The Land and the Book with Charlie Dyer. So as soon as we parked in the parking garage, I trot right across the street up to the 9th floor of Kroll Hall on the campus of Moody Bible Institute, and I see if the provost might be in. And sure enough, oh, Tim, come on in. And what can I do for you? Well, Dr. Wexler and I, we were carpooling in, and we were just listening to, did you hear NPR this morning? Blah, blah, blah. And what would you think about of doing a chapel, maybe together, maybe like, oh yeah, we could participate, we could each take 15 minutes, and we could, you know, we need to hit this from a biblical perspective and get what does the Bible teach about these things. And then, we need some historical background. Many people are completely unaware of what the history has been with the Arab-Israeli conflict. And then, well, we also need to address some very important ethical issues because, people are dying in the Middle East. And people's sympathies can be divided, and people could have a moral lack of clarity. So let's address from three angles: biblical, historical, and ethical. And together we combined to provide a talk that we eventually kind of took on the road and shared it in multiple locations. And then each of us have continued to talk about this subject for years and years now, but that's the origin of this conversation I'd like to have with you tonight. And I'd like to point out the title that I've given, at least the first word of the title, because I'm not claiming to have the final word on this complicated topic. I'd like to offer what I would humbly suggest to you would be a proper perspective. It happens to be my perspective. I guess that's why I'm the one talking. So I have to own it. And it is my perspective. But I would like to suggest that it's proper to hold this perspective. And you might say, well, what perspective is that? Well, I'll tell you at the end of 3 talks, because we'll give you, in the end, my top 10 list of what a proper perspective would look like. But if you've already had too much and you're on your way out the door in any moment now and you think, okay, I do wonder about the top 10 list, but I'm not planning to come back tomorrow. Well, you have the top 10 list on the back side with the blanks. But if you want the blanks filled in, on the back table there are some little bookmarks. And those not only have the blanks filled in, it has the top 10 list, but it also has something that this handout does not. And that's by each of the top 10 points, some scripture references. In other words, if you would like to turn this into a Bible study of your own and take it on the road and share it with others, go for it. Spread the word. Further, I would say that I would hope that each of us can learn enough about what the scriptures teach us, about the facts of history, and about the parsing of these complicated ethical issues, that we would each develop a proper perspective. And perhaps, and I want to hold this out to you as a bit of a challenge and really an invitation, maybe you look at my top 10 list and you think, well, why didn't you address this? Or what about that? I mean, isn't, you come up with a point that might be more important than the 10 I've listed? Please tell me about it. It could be that maybe I'd say, you're absolutely right. That's very important. And I'll find one of my 10 to eliminate, to kick down to number 11, and yours can go in the top 10 list. So because we're going to spend some time together today and tomorrow and Sunday, maybe we can have some peaceful conversation, some appropriate dialogue about these complicated issues. And I would welcome your feedback and your input, because I never did claim to have the final proper perspective on these things, but I do care about them a lot, and I've been thinking about them for, 35 years. It was 1989 when I moved to Israel to take my junior year of college and to live on a kibbutz. And it was only after I returned, and then the dust began to settle, that history began to tell us that I lived in Israel during what became known as the First Intifada, or uprising, of the local Arabs against Israel. I mean, you don't know that you're in the first intifada when it's happening. Just like people in World War I didn't realize they were in World War I. This is what historians have to tell them later. And of course, they never called it World War I until there was a World War II. And so see, I've been personally living some of this history for 35 years because my family and I eventually come to find out something else I didn't know while I was taking my junior year of college in Israel, that after I returned from Israel, this young lady went to Israel and took her summer after her junior year from another university. And then she came back to the United States, and we met that fall. And 7 months later we were engaged, and 4 months after that we were married, and that was 32 years ago. So we have a little bit of history with Israel. We wanted our children to experience some of the important aspects of being able to study the Bible on location. And there's really no better classroom in the world than to go where it all happened. So Moody Bible Institute granted me a sabbatical after 7 years, and we found a way that since their sabbatical policy was very generous to allow us to be gone for 2 semesters, and the policy at the time was that your summers are really your summers. This is when you read and write and research and prepare for your classes. So really we had what some have called the 3 best things about a teaching job: June, July, and August. We had the summers available. And when my sabbatical came around, I took the summers months before and the summer months after, and we parsed that into 15 months that we lived in Israel. And during that time, we tossed our young kids into the deep side of the pool, לבית ספר ישראלי, to an Israeli school, איפה שהם רק דיברו בעברית, where they only spoke in Hebrew. והם בכו משהו כארבעה חודשים, and they cried for something like 4 months. But then they cried in Hebrew. And I said, see how fun it is to be bilingual? And now they speak to me in Hebrew every day. So that's a blessing. We then had the opportunity, did I mention the 3 best things about a teaching job? Because of the 15 months we spent there and the relationships that we developed. By the way, during that school year, not the summer, but during the academic year, I taught biblical archaeology for the Master's College Israel Bible Extension Campus, or they call it the IBEX program at the Master's College. And by the way, some people really dig archaeology. So I taught biblical archaeology for that academic year. In fact, the first half of the first semester, I was really learning it myself. The students were getting my notes like hot out of the printer because I just finished typing up the lecture and printing it before class. And then by the next semester, then they were getting brand new PowerPoints and the notes that I had already done from last semester. And so I'm learning as I go. You just got to stay a few archaeological periods and discoveries ahead of the students. And for the midterm exam, I thought, okay, I've got to come up with some good questions here. How about this? Define archaeology. I mean, you're in an introductory course. You got to know what it is, right? So one student, he wrote the answer, the study of the ark. And I thought, that's not really where I was going with that. I can see where, okay, creative. So, but I thought I'd change it up and make it a little more, for the final exam, I'd clarify what I meant. And I said, what is an archaeologist? And this same student said, it's a person whose career lies in ruins. And I thought, again, not where I was going with that, but I'm glad he digs archaeology. We would then find that because of the relationships built during those 15 months and our prior opportunity when we were even younger to study in Israel ourselves, lots of doors were flying open for us to be able to both host tours in Israel study tours for newcomers and repeat business of people who, sometimes it gets in your blood, you just got to keep going. Like I went once, but I'm going again. And sometimes you meet people who, well, what do you do every summer? Well, I go on another tour of Israel. Like, okay, that's great. So we began to try to make that happen for people. And then to also partner with various organizations and do service trips and the like. Well, our kids would go back with us each summer, and they would help in sports camps and the like, since they speak Hebrew. And so for about 13 years running, we would spend each of our summers in Israel. And of course, that meant that we were there during the good times and the bad. Our children learned things like how to get from the playground to the bomb shelter in 30 seconds, because that's how much time they had when the air raid sirens began to sound. And it was a little startling for them when we came back to the States and they heard the air raid siren here, but it wasn't the air raid siren, it was the monthly test in our town or suburb for storm warnings and such, but it sounded exactly like the air raid siren in Israel. And you should have the panic, like, because we don't have a bomb shelter to go to. So they were wondering where to go. All of these stories are simply to illustrate that we have a connection to the land and we care very much about what happens there. In addition to having taught in Israel at a number of institutions, I've also had the privilege of teaching at Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary in Amman, Jordan, where Arab Christians from numerous countries are coming to this very westernized, but still very Middle Eastern, Muslim majority, Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And because of the opportunities and friendship with their founder and president, I was able to craft a program. This was after the events of 9/11, 2001, when many evangelicals began to have the world of Islam on their radar screen and thinking that maybe we should seek to share the gospel in Muslim majority countries. But you realize a lot of times ministry is very romantic sounding until you actually get there and do it. Even teaching a Sunday school class or a ladies' Bible study or, singing in the choir, it reminds me of that little poem, "To dwell above with saints we love, oh, that will be glory. But to dwell below with saints we know, well, that's another story." It's more difficult when you actually are doing it. Then you find all the problems. And sadly, many people who think, I want to be a missionary in some far-flung country, wouldn't that be amazing? We've had missionaries at our church. I want to be a missionary. Great. And then you actually get up the nerve to actually go somewhere, and you might go poorly prepared. No one told you the packing list you're going to need. No one gave you any cultural background about what to expect. And you realize, especially maybe going from the free world of the United States of America to a Muslim majority country, that they don't do everything like we do here. And you might not enjoy the same level of freedoms and privileges that you enjoy here, and especially for women. If all the other ladies are covered from head to toe and you're not, you could be, targeted for some degree of mistreatment or disapproval at minimum. And it can just be uncomfortable. Or you might not like the food. Or you realize Arabic, that's not the most easy language to learn. It's a little more difficult than, just donde el baño. It's not, you're not gonna just pick that up from a couple trips to Taco Bell. It doesn't look anything like you've ever seen, and it's And we began to see that many people with great intentions to do ministry in the Middle East, they might, have already graduated from Bible college, and they're married, maybe they have a small family, and this means, oh wow, this is going to take some considerable financial outlay to get them there. And I don't mean just the flights. Now we're going to need to make sure they have some apartment to live in or home. What about a car? What about schooling their children? So you have all of this expense to get people on the field. And then, of course, they're going to have to be in language school. And they're going to have to think about, how will I learn this culture? How do we shop? How do we this? How do we that? And it's very different from just going on a tour or a little ministry trip where you're kind of sanitized in your whole experience. Like maybe you do a little bits of service, but you don't even have to put gas in the car, which even that in a foreign country where you can't read things and where maybe the credit card doesn't work the same way, and it all can be so frustrating. And then how do you shop for groceries and how do you cook? And then in some countries, it's not just you turn the water on and it's always there. You actually have to get your tanks filled with water from a water truck that comes to your house. And it's like very, very different world. So you see that some will go to great sacrificial lengths to get there. Then they'll be learning about a people group that they've never really encountered much before, and how to live in a country that speaks a language they don't know, and then they might not be gifted at language learning, and so it's hard, and then maybe the culture has frustrating things about it that they don't like, and maybe they don't even like the food, and will they even last a 4-year term without coming home feeling completely like failures, shamed that they wasted so much money, the Lord's money, and the Lord's people's money, and they're never going back? And maybe it's stressed out their marriage like crazy because one of them really wants to be there and the other is like, I can't wait to get on the next plane out of here. Can you relate to this a little bit? And so as we began to see at a school like Moody Bible Institute, which is training people to, as the then president, Dr. Joseph Stoll, who hired me way back in the day, he used to say, the sun never sets on Moody grads. And it's because, they're everywhere. As I began to think about those who want to serve in the Middle East and how these difficulties were facing them, I thought, maybe if while they're younger and can live a little more cheaply and have a few less responsibilities, they could find out, do they like hummus or not? And can they pronounce some difficult sounding, guttural sounds in the Arabic language? And can they expose themselves to some cultural differences and see if they can develop an appreciation and even a love for these people? And so, with the help of some colleagues, I crafted a curriculum and an agreement between a few different schools, the Moody Bible Institute, the Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary, and then this program that has trained more missionaries to speak Arabic than any other over the last 50 years. It's called the Kelsey Arabic Program in Amman. And our students could go, they could learn Arabic, they could have evangelical Arab students studying with them in the classroom at JETS, Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary, and all those credits were worked out in this curriculum so that they wouldn't lose a year or a semester of credits, and they could transfer those right back into their majors at Moody Bible Institute. This program we called the Salam program, studying Arabic language and Arab ministry. Salam. And thankfully that program is still going on today, long after I've been gone from Moody Bible Institute. Well, a few little background stories so that, beyond Pastor Mike's very generous introduction, you can know a little something about my background in life and ministry in the Middle East. Additionally, I'll be telling you about a book that Dr. Fruchtenbaum and I, long before I ever thought of coming on with REL Ministries, we both contributed to a volume edited by our mutual friend, Randall Price, called What Should We Think About Israel? Separating Fact and Fiction in the Middle East. More about that a little later. And copies available that we'll tell you about. Well, for tonight, I want to begin our first session then in the Bible. Like, that should be the best starting place, really. Israel and Palestine, these words are in the news every day. I remember this old meme that said, you know, you have the two leaders back in the day, and what do you know, they're still in the news now. But here's what they're thinking. Finally, something the Israelis and the Palestinians can agree on. What is it? When will the Americans stop wasting my time with these pointless meetings? In other words, it's not like they are just dying to have peace in the Middle East, or maybe they are dying because of the lack of peace in the Middle East. But this geography and this geopolitics is in the news nearly every day. Mahmoud Abbas was elected to be president of the Palestinians and serve as the leader of the Palestinian Authority back in 2005 for a 4-year term. And there's never been an election since. There's just such chaos within Palestinian society. They've never held an election. Can you imagine that happening in the United States? Well, 4 years come and go, and, well, we're just not getting along well enough to have another election, and the person is still there 20 years later. On the Israeli side, various people have come and gone and come back as prime minister. Whether it was someone like Ehud Barak, Ariel Sharon, Ehud Olmert, Naftali Bennett, and so forth. And you might notice this name at the end, Benjamin Netanyahu, or Bibi for short, that he's been in and out, and he's back in again. And some people love it, and some people, well, it's kind of just like our own country, a real political divide. Sometimes big demonstrations in the streets and calls for re-elections and the like. It would be the desire of some to think that a powerful country like the United States could just kind of push our way in there and zip up this divide and give a roadmap to peace, perhaps, and try to make it work. But I'd like to suggest to you that the problems are deeper than merely political problems. They go way back to biblical times. And one problem that many secular analysts simply have blinders on and cannot admit that the problem is there is that at the heart of this conflict there are religious and theological issues between Jews and Muslims and Christians, and many people just don't, you know, they've been taught. We don't talk about religion and politics. But guess what's going on over there? Someone needs a perspective on the religion and the politics. And so, before we attempt to solve anything, or even rightly understand the problems, I really appreciate the following quote that comes from Lorraine Bettner in his book on a completely different subject, but also one over which Christians have been divided over the years. And it's this: it's the Christian attitude toward war. He states this on page 12 of his book: all philosophical speculation and emotional sentiment should be held in abeyance until we have first heard the testimony of Scripture. This phrase, held in abeyance, it means essentially to be put off. Like, don't just speculate. Don't feel so deeply about this until at least you've heard what the Bible has to say. Let the Scriptures inform your strong feelings. And thus, we turn first to the Bible to help us gain a theological perspective on these issues. Tomorrow we'll also look at some of the history of this conflict, and then turn our attention to the ethical issues at stake. And so for now, you have a handout with an outline. This outline we will allow to be our guide as we look tonight at Roman numeral 1, the biblical and theological areas that provide us with a proper perspective on Israel and the Middle East. We want to begin looking at the establishment of the land of promise. The establishment of the land promise. And under that, several passages of Scripture that tell us the intent of God's promises. What was He promising? And then we'll look at the extent. How much was He promising? We'll also consider the maintenance of the land promise, meaning, is this something that God still cares about today, or is this just one of those facts of history that in the Bible there are verses about the land? The maintenance of the land promise, and then finally the fulfillment of the land promise. So that's where we're going. Some would say that an informed tourist is a happy tourist. So you tell them the itinerary for the day, and I've just told you the itinerary for our evening together. Well, with that, I'd ask you to buckle up, because here we go. So we would turn first to Genesis. That's always a good place to begin. That's what the word means. In the beginning, the Genesis, the start of God's not only creation, but also of His revelation. This book records not only the beginning of all humanity and of the world as we know it, but also the beginning of the problem of sin in Genesis chapter 3, the beginning of the plan of God being revealed to redeem humanity from sin in Genesis 3:15, but also the beginning of family lines that are spoken about with the genealogies found in Genesis chapter 10, for instance. And then shortly following this, like, lay of the land sort of passage in Genesis chapter 10, that you could read these names and also look at a map and kind of see where people went after the flood, where Noah's descendants would go. We come to one of his descendants from the line of Shem, one of them named Abram. And in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 7, we read about how the Lord said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." So Abram left, as the Lord had told him, and they set out for the land of Canaan. And they arrived there. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." Can I point out to you that Abram was not over there in Ur of the Chaldees thinking, I wonder how fun it would be to leave here. And I'd really like to speculate about some real estate opportunities over in the land of Canaan. It was never his idea in the first place. In fact, the word land appears not in the voice or words attributed to Abram, but in the words spoken by the Lord. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. So Abram left, as the Lord told him, and they set out for the land. There it is again, of Canaan. They arrived there, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this." See it? There it is, repetitively. It's repetitive. It's redundant, from the Department of Redundancy department. I mean, it's like 3 times already. It's the Lord who's brought this up to Abram, and we're just in the first verses of Genesis chapter 12. In the next chapter, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, "Lift up your eyes from where you are and look north, south, east, and west. All the land you see I will give to you and your offspring." For how long? Forever. "Go and walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I'm giving it to you." Fast forward 2 chapters, Genesis 15, verses 18 through 21. "On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, 'To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt,'" and friends, that's very likely known today as Wadi El Arish. Don't think of the Nile River, deep inside of Egypt, but think of the river from Canaan that leads to Egypt. It's just south of the Gaza Strip. "From the river of Egypt, Wadi El Arish is its name, to the great river, the Euphrates. And then notice that it wasn't empty when God was promising it to Abram. Notice who's there. It's the land of the Canaanites, the Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites, all the Balatites and electric lights. I mean, it was full of people. All the isms, wasms, and spasms, they're all there. And, you know, the Lord could have, for the promised land, just chosen something like Hawaii. You know, we could just have lots of happy Jewish people there, having pina coladas and drinking coconut milk and, you know, palm trees and breezy skies and beaches. And who cares about the Middle East? Let them have it. But that's not what God did at all. He chose the land bridge between 3 continents. You realize, even bird migrations, they go right through Israel. And not only bird migrations, trade from all the various parts, even trade among mariners. They would come to the port at modern-day Eilat, ancient Etzion Geber, or Aqaba on the Jordanian side, and bring goods from India and what we might call China today, all through those South Seas, and then it would be brought really into Europe through this before there ever was a Suez Canal. Well, this land was full of people. If you were in Europe and you wanted to go by land and get to Africa, this is where you have to go. If you were on the far other side of the Fertile Crescent near the Persian Gulf, but you want to trade with people near the pyramids and the Nile River, you got to go through this land. It's as if the Lord said, I'm going to put you right in the thick of things. I mean, if you're going to be a light to the nations, you got to meet some of the nations. And if I put you right here, you're going to meet them all. They'll all be in your way, and you'll be in their way. This was God's plan from the beginning. Further, Genesis 17:8. The whole, what? Land of Canaan, where you are now an alien, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. Now, you might say, are you sure by the end of the Torah, the first 5 books, the books of Moses, was this still the plan? I mean, because they go into Egypt, they stay a lot longer than they planned, they're in bondage and slavery, and then God brings them out, and you know, they disobey in the wilderness, and it takes 40 years to go on what would have been an 11 days journey, but are they still going to go to the land? Well, fast forward to the last book of the Torah, Deuteronomy. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, now Deuteronomy. And toward the end of that book, Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 4 and 5. Even if you had been banished to the most distant land under the heavens, which, by the way, is predicting the exile. Even if you get exiled, from there, the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. He will bring you to the land that belonged to your fathers, and you will take possession of it. Well, again, maybe you think, well, okay, that was plan A. But then they go in under Joshua, remember, Moses' successor, Joshua, and lots of taking over the land of Canaan happens, but there are these hints in the book of Joshua, and certainly you read about them in the book of Judges, where they failed to drive out the Canaanites. And finally the Lord says, I'm actually just going to leave the Canaanites here to be a snare to you, because you didn't drive them out like I commanded you to do, and now you're going to have to deal with that and learn to trust me with the Canaanites in your midst. So let's fast forward to the major prophets, to Isaiah, for instance, who writes, you blew it and God is done with you. See ya. No, that's not exactly what the book of Isaiah says. In Isaiah chapter 14, verse 1, we read, the Lord will have compassion on Jacob. By the way, remember Jacob? His name was changed to Israel. We read, once again, he will choose Israel. See, a synonym for the descendants of Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, and this line that comes from them. Once again, he will choose Israel, meaning the people of Israel, and will settle them, see, their people, where? In their own land. Notice, even if Israel is in disobedience, whose land is it? It says their own land. I think of this when we were raising our children and they were teenagers. They just escaped the teenage years now, relatively unscathed. I love to say all of our kids love the Lord and they love us, and we're trying not to mess that up. So we continue to pray that they will continue on with the Lord, and we're so grateful they are. But let's just say, maybe I don't need to use my own kids as an example here, but let's say they're your kids. And they're driving the family van. And they decide they're going to pick up a bunch of their friends. And they pack way too many of them in the family van. And the music is too loud, and they're distracted with their, devices, and the traffic, and they run a red light, and thankfully, by God's grace, it's not major damage, but they get into a little fender bender, and you realize that this is God's mercy. This could have been very serious, but it's just a car, with a little damage now. And it was the old family van to begin with, so you do the responsible thing as a parent, and you express lovingly your concerns, and you might pull the keys for a time, and they're appropriately being, whatever you want to call it, made aware of the seriousness of this set of poor decisions, and they're not driving. They're having to find other ways to not do what they would like to do, and yet your goal probably isn't, wow, I'm so glad I get to drive the family van, the old van with dings in it and a bit of rust and whatnot, and I've been waiting around to get to my age so that I could drive this old family van. No, this is you're not taking it away forever. In fact, it could be that by the time a week or so goes by, you realize I really don't want to go buy the milk at the corner store. You finally tell you what, here are the keys, be careful, and you're hoping the lesson sticks, and in the end you didn't give the van to the neighbor kids down the road. It was still the family van that they were going to get to drive, but you were using their enjoyment of it to be somewhat of an indicator of their responsible choices. You were disciplining them, discipling them, you were teaching them through the enjoyment or lack of enjoyment of the use of this vehicle. And yet, there was never any long-term question if this van would eventually be, theirs. I see that like this wording here, where after a promise of discipline to disobedient Israel, God still calls it their own land. I think this is an important point to make. He gave it by means of an unconditional covenant promise, and he will keep his word, even if Israel does not keep its responsibility. Let's continue on in this discussion of the intent of God's promises. Jeremiah 30, verse 3, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will bring my people Israel and Judah back from captivity and restore them to the land I gave their fathers to possess. Notice, I gave it to their fathers to possess, and even if they've been in captivity, which means like a timeout. It's going back to them. God's going to restore it to them. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 10. Hear the word of the Lord, O nations. Proclaim it in distant coastlands. Now, why would it need to be proclaimed to all those people? Think about this. What was going to be proclaimed? He who scattered Israel will gather them and will watch over his flock like a shepherd. In other words, God wants all the nations to be aware of his plan for Israel and how he's working with the people of Israel, whom other passages they are called the first fruits among the nations. The first fruits among the nation, or maybe you've heard the term the chosen people. Chosen for what? It looks like chosen for a lot of persecution. I mean, within the Jewish community, we've often said things like, we're the chosen people, and the Egyptians tried to kill us. We're the chosen people, and the Persians tried to kill us. We're the chosen people, and the Greeks tried to kill us, and the Romans tried to kill us. Wouldn't you choose someone else once in a while? I mean, it's not always fun being the chosen people, the ones through whom God is revealing himself to the world. I mean, look, if you have a Bible today, where did you get that? I mean, yes, you could look at the publisher and it might be printed here in the USA, but that Bible wasn't written in English, not originally. The first parts of that Bible were all written in Hebrew. And then it was, in the New Testament, written largely by Greek-speaking Jewish people. So God was using the people of Israel in a way to be a light to the Gentiles. And if you know about the God of the Bible, you know about the God of Israel. Friends, he wants the nations to know about his plans for Israel that included Israel, and how it should be even proclaimed in distant coastlands that he who scattered Israel will gather them once again. Further, Ezekiel 37, verses 21 and 22, I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back to their own land. See that phrase? It's repeated again. Whose land? To their own land. I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel. Or Ezekiel 47, verse 14, because I swore with uplifted hand to give it to your forefathers. By the way, does God have to swear and say, what, I promise? I mean, who's he going to swear by? Like other people might say, I swear to God. He's not. Why would he use this terminology? Well, for our benefit as humans, we have to see, like, first of all, God is spirit, and he didn't, but he's speaking about how sure his promises are, as if he swore with an uplifted hand to give this land to your forefathers. This land, what does the promise say? Will become your inheritance. It's just right there in the text. Further, Amos chapter 9, verse 15. I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land I have given to them, says the Lord your God. Obadiah, which has no chapters, only one chapter, and so in verses 17 and 20 we read, and the house of Jacob will possess its inheritance. The company of Israelite exiles who were in Canaan will possess the land as far as Zarephath, and the exiles from Jerusalem who were in Sepharad will possess the towns of the Negev. You see the idea of possessing an inheritance, possessing the land, possessing the towns. Further, Micah 7, verse 20. You will be true to Jacob and show mercy to Abraham, as you pledged on oath to our fathers in days long ago. It's like that verse that said he swore with an uplifted hand. Here it says he pledged on oath. How certain are God's promises? I mean, he doesn't even have to say he pledged. He raised his hand. He swore. But in case that helps you, he's ready to say all of those things about this promise of the land. So, friends, this is the intent of God's promises. And now, briefly, let's consider some passages, two passages that deal with the extent of God's promises. In other words, how much land? We know it was some land. How much? Two passages. They are Numbers chapter 34 and Ezekiel 47. Why these passages? Because specific boundaries were recorded by Moses in Numbers 34 prior to Israel's first entry into the Promised Land in 1400 BC after the Exodus. And then once again, specific boundaries are recorded by Ezekiel in chapter 47 prior to Judah's return to the land following the Babylonian captivity in 539 BC. If both passages contain boundaries, like this is the land that was promised, it would be interesting to know if something changed because of Israel's disobedience. Like, you know, I was going to buy you that race car, but because you sped and broke the speed limit in the old family van, now you're getting, you know, a clunker, you know. Did the boundaries change? So here we go. If you look in the book of Numbers, chapter 34, consider the northern boundary. For your northern boundary, run a line from the Great Sea. By the way, what sea is that? The Mediterranean. To Mount Hor, and from Mount Hor to Lebo Hamath. Then the boundary will go to Zedad, continue to Ziphron, and end at Hazal Enan. This will be your boundary on the north. Now those places might not be so familiar to you on the map today, but please note the similarity in that passage to what is said to the Israelite exiles returning from Babylon, Ezekiel chapter 47, verses 15 to 17. On the north side it will run from the Great Sea by the Hethlon road past Lebo Hamath to Zedad. See those same locations mentioned again? And then it gives a few more details because these returnees, they haven't lived there. So they need, you know, like turn left at the red barn next to the black cow, and, you know, a few more details. And so it lists places like Berotah and Zibraim, which lies on the border between Damascus and Hamat, as far as Hazer Hatikon, which is on the border of Haran. The boundary will extend from the sea to Hazar Enan along the northern road of Damascus, with a border of Hamat to the north. This will be the northern boundary. If you look at these two passages, you've got to see quite a lot of overlap and similarity. You're drawing the line in the same place on the map. That's the northern boundary. Let's compare when we look at the eastern boundary. For your eastern boundary, run a line from Hazar Enan to Shepham. The boundary will go down from Shepham to Riblah on the east side of Ain and continue along the slopes east of the Sea of Kinneret, which today many people will call the Sea of Galilee in English, but in Hebrew it's the Kinneret. Then the boundary will go down along the Jordan, meaning the Jordan River, and end at the Salt Sea. You might know it as the Dead Sea. Well, sure enough, Ezekiel 47 concurs with Numbers 34, where we read that on the east side, the boundary will run between Haran and Damascus, along the Jordan, between Gilead and the land of Israel, to the eastern sea, as far as Tamar. This will be the east boundary. So far, so good. Now, the southern boundary. On your southern side will include some of the desert of Zin. You perhaps have heard of the wilderness of Zin, where the Israelites were during the book of Numbers, along the border of Edom. On the east, your southern boundary will start from the end of the Salt Sea, cross south of Scorpion Pass, continue on to Sin, and go south of Kadesh Barnea. Then it will go to Hazar Adar and over to Asmon, where it will turn, join the Wadi of Egypt, and end at the sea. In Ezekiel 47, we read about this southern boundary. On the south side, it will run from Tamar as far as the waters of Meribah Kadesh. By the way, you don't have to be an ancient Semitic scholar to note the similarity between Kadesh Barnea and Meribah Kadesh. This overlap of words lets you know we're talking about the same site. Then, along the Wadi of Egypt to the Great Sea. Two other places that are also mentioned in Numbers 34. This will be the southern boundary. And then the western boundary is the easiest because, you know, think of the map in your head. You already know what the western boundary is. And would you know that no one disputes that boundary? It's always the Mediterranean. When you get to the water, stop here. That's the boundary. And so your western boundary will be the coast of the Great Sea. Numbers 34, verse 6. This will be your boundary on the west. Ezekiel 47, on the west side, the Great Sea will be the boundary to a point opposite Lebo Hamath. This will be the west boundary. And now, what would that look like on a map? Charlie Dyer, whom I mentioned earlier, provided this helpful illustration of, on the south, there along the Mediterranean, you're looking at the area of Wadi El Arish, the southern boundary, and then it goes into the Negev Desert, the wilderness of Zin area, and then up through the Salt Sea or Dead Sea, and along the Jordan River, near the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, and then it goes out toward Damascus and encompasses that area of the Golan Heights, and then back over north of Beirut to the Mediterranean again. I like how one geographer noted that Israel is surrounded by 4 bodies of water. One's at the head, the other is dead. The third one's red, and the fourth is the Med. So there you go, 4 bodies of water. Here are the boundaries, which tell us about the intent and extent of the land promise. Well, some might ask, okay, those are promises. They're found in the Bible. How does that help me have a proper perspective on the Middle East today? Isn't that like the Old Testament? Isn't that like Bible times? How does that relate to today? And some would suggest we shouldn't even be looking at the Bible to give us insight into these important modern issues. And so I want to address something about the maintenance of the land promise. Some systems of theology claim that because Israel failed to receive Jesus as the Messiah, all of their promises are now nullified. God promised and offered certain blessings, but because of their disobedience, all bets are off. I'd like to address that, looking first at Romans chapter 11, verses 28 and 29. From the standpoint of the gospel, this would be, in the context of the passage, a reference to unbelieving Jewish people who refuse to accept Jesus as the Messiah. They are enemies for your sake, like ideological enemies concerning the gospel. Like, are we going to agree about this? No. So, ideological enemies. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers, meaning those people to whom God gave those promises in the beginning. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchs. They're still loved by God because of those promises given to the fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Perhaps you should highlight, circle, underline this word, irrevocable. Meaning, can they be revoked? No. They're ongoing. They're current. They're in play. This is still plan A, not plan B. And in the end, don't you have to appreciate that when God makes promises, He just keeps them? Because I think of this in terms of the issue of, can you lose your salvation? Some groups teach that it's possible for those who have trusted in Jesus as their Savior and forgiver of sins, have trusted in the truth of the gospel, to do something, to sin big enough so that, well, you were saved, but now you're not. Friends, I want to tell you, if I could have lost my salvation by now, it would have been gone. And if I would get to know you a little better, my guess is that you would have lost yours too. I mean, because no one is as consistent as we should be. We do not always keep our promises like God keeps His promises. But guess what? Our eternal salvation is based on the fact that God keeps His promise. Even when we're faithless, He is faithful. Thankfully, the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Further, Paul says in a passage in Galatians chapter 3, verses 17 and 18, what I am saying is this, meaning this is Paul being clear, breaking it down, putting the cookies on the bottom shelf so everybody can eat. He says, the law, which came 430 years later, does not invalidate a covenant previously ratified by God so as to nullify the promise. And by the way, if that wasn't immediately clear what Paul means, perhaps you can appreciate why Peter said that some of Paul's teachings are difficult to understand. But let's try. First of all, we have here in verse 17 a reference to a timeline of 430 years and something that came later. What came later? The law came later. Later than what? A covenant that was previously ratified by God. If you think 430 years before the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, who was there receiving a covenant? Who was in the biblical storyline receiving a covenant promise from God? Abraham. That's what this text will go on to tell us. But even though Israel received the law and failed to obey it, that doesn't nullify the promise that was previously given to Abraham. This is Paul's argument. For if the inheritance is based on law, it's no longer based on a promise, but God granted it to Abram as by means of a promise. So, something that's not in your notes, this is free, the Abrahamic covenant as the basis for the rest of the biblical covenants goes something like this. I like to refer to the Abrahamic covenant as the umbrella covenant, under which other covenant promises are also offered. For instance, the land aspect of the Abrahamic covenant, because God promises to Abraham land, seed, and blessing, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And the land aspect of the Abrahamic covenant is further developed and outlined and clarified through what has been called the Mosaic covenant, or the Sinai covenant, because that's where it happened. The Mosaic covenant, that's with whom it happened. He's the mediator of this covenant. And it talks about how to live in covenant obedience with God in the land. He spells out all of these commandments for Israel, in fact 613 of them to be exact. And it's like the national charter of Israel, telling them how to live in covenant obedience in the land. Now, the seed aspect of the Abrahamic covenant, that is further spoken of to David, who is promised a line of descendants or seed through whom the Messiah would one day come. And then blessing, this aspect of the Abrahamic covenant, is further developed in what can be called the New Covenant. And passages like Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31 and following speak about this new covenant promise of spiritual blessings and salvation. Or, if you like another way to illustrate it, two mountains are associated with two of these aspects of the Abrahamic covenant. The Sinai location, this mountain is associated with Moses and the land promise, whereas Zion is associated with the Messiah and the spiritual blessings that come through him. So we come back to this issue of the Abrahamic covenant. And we answer the final question of the evening, the fulfillment of the land promise. Is it really going to happen? Is it still God's plan that he will come good on these irrevocable promises? Well, we have a number of passages that suggest that that is exactly the case. For instance, Isaiah 27, verse 12, and it will come about in that day that the Lord will start his threshing from the flowing stream of the Euphrates to the brook of Egypt, and you will be gathered up one by one, O sons of Israel. God is going to gather up the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Jacob whose name is changed to Israel. He'll gather them, and he'll do that in this same area of the promised land, from the Euphrates to the brook of Egypt. Further, in Ezekiel 20, verses 42 to 44, and you will know that I am the Lord when I bring you into the land of Israel, into the land which I swore to give to your forefathers. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about this, but I just want you to know that, are they going to know that he's the Lord before that? This is predicting that he's bringing them back to the land in unbelief, gathering them in unbelief. And after they're gathered back, at a later time, then you will know that I am the Lord when I bring you into the land. Further, why would God do this? Ezekiel 36, verses 27 to 32. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes. God is going to give Israel the faith to believe. God is going to cause them to be obedient. And why would he do this? Verse 32 tells us, I'm not doing this for your sake, declares the Lord. Let it be known to you. Be ashamed and confounded for your ways, O house of Israel. Why would he do it? He's doing it for the sake of his name, because he made promises, and his character causes him to keep his promises. Well, we're talking about this small little land. It's so small, all of Israel could fit inside of Lake Michigan. I was in Texas this morning, and all of the Middle East could fit inside of Texas.
Whoa.
From the Persian Gulf to the Nile River. And the Texans, they're like, yeah, we know, Texas is big. But friends, when we think about this little land, it's almost so microscopic on the map you have to highlight it to know, like that little part right there, that's the one in the news nearly every day. That's the one fought about for centuries. That's the one where people have such strong opinions, they're going to war over this on a regular basis. But my prayer is that as we would seek to develop a proper perspective on Israel and the Middle East, we might turn first to Scripture as our starting point. And that's what we've attempted to do tonight. Do you want to take 2 minutes for questions, or you want some cookies right now? Yeah. Okay, go.
Again, describe the brook of Egypt and that river that I've
Yeah.
always been confused about that.
Sure. Well, let's go back to a map that might help us. And that would allow us to say, for instance, here, just below the Gaza Strip, kind of near the current boundary with Egypt and Israel today, is a little body of water that's more like a seasonal stream bed. That's the word wadi. Wadi is a seasonal stream bed. It's used actually even in some English Bibles in the book of Job, where Job's friends are insulted by Job once they turn on him. And he says, you are deceptive like a wadi. Now, I don't know if you've ever insulted your friends that way. You called them wadis. What did he say? But a wadi is, it's there, it looks like a river, and then in the dry season, it's not. It looks like desert. And so this little brook on the way to Egypt, from a perspective of being in the land of Israel, it's the last brook before you get into Egypt. Wadi, today it's known as Wadi El Arish, A-R-I-S-H.
It's not the Sinai Peninsula, it's above this.
No, it's so small you can't even see it on the map. It's this seasonal stream bed. It's like an impression, and when it rains, then it can be full of water like a big river. Yeah.
Isn't it supposed to go to the Euphrates River?
Yeah, so, yes, and it could, be that it's all the way up here. Yeah.
Okay, and with the recent rains in Jerusalem, did it affect that wadi at all?
Oh yeah. I mean, when there's plenty of water, then the wadis fill up, especially in the winter season. And they're in Northern Hemisphere, so our winter is their winter. Yeah. Anybody else?
So again, just to say that again, so in the northern part, the Bible talks about the river Euphrates. We're talking about the river Euphrates all the way north.
Yes.
Right?
Well, to the river Euphrates, from the Euphrates to the river of Egypt.
So
Now,
the
it
red
can't-
light should be up there.
It could, but remember in those passages that we talked about, it mentions some places on the land, and it says, then draw a line from here to there and go to this one. And that's why this is here. And so it could mean, from this perspective, you're basically moving into the, out there to where the Euphrates.
Okay.
And so this is somewhat an interpretive guess about, so what do you do with those specific places that are mentioned? We know those are included. If that's the boundary, then they're drawing the red line there. but it's certainly that area, like, up as you go toward the Euphrates.
And then the red line going north and south, that's straight, that's the Jordan River?
Yes. Yeah, from the Jordan River, which begins with the tributaries that flow from Mount Hermon, and it flows into the Sea of Galilee, and then it flows out of the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea, the lowest point on the face of the earth at about 1,300 feet below sea level. By the way, the word Jordan in Hebrew is the Yarden. The Yarden comes from the word Yarad, and Yarad means to go down. It is the go down river. Mount Hermon is about 9,000 feet above sea level, and it goes down, down, down into the Sea of Galilee, which is already below sea level, the Sea of Galilee. And then it goes out of the Sea of Galilee, and it goes down, 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 and it goes into the Dead Sea at 1,300 feet below sea level.
The Sea of Galilee is below the sea level?
Absolutely.
Well,
In fact, as we go down the hill in the bus, I point out the big sign that says sea level, and I tell people, hold your breath, because we're not going to be, we're staying in a hotel down there. We won't be back here till tomorrow. Hold your breath while we go down by the shore of the Sea of Galilee.
That's all big crack in the earth is the rift zone.
Yes, this has been called the Syro-African Rift, because it starts up here in modern-day Syria, and it goes down all the way through the Jordan Rift Valley, which is part of the Syro-African Rift, because notice it goes through here as well in the desert between modern-day Jordan and the Negev Desert. This is called the Arava, and then it goes in further down in the Gulf of Aqaba, and then it keeps going and it goes into Egypt. In other words, this is the longest fault line in the world.
Goes down to the
It's just
Tanzania.
not my fault. Well, with that, friends, I should let you go. But I'm here. If you want to chat, thanks for coming. And we'll do this again tomorrow. What time are we starting tomorrow?
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock?
If you want a breakfast, come at 9.
Wow, that's very nice. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Breakfast.
So tomorrow at 10 o'clock, we have some cookies and whatnot
Out here now.
out here now. But tomorrow, I saw a cheesecake, homemade cheesecake, I think. Some cheese Danish and various other things to tempt you if you come a little bit early tomorrow for breakfast. So we hope to have you turn out tomorrow, because this is an important topic broken down into 3 parts that I think is going to be very informative, because what we're hearing from a lot of our information sources is incomplete. Let's put it that way. Incomplete.
Good way to say it.